He bought a broken gas station for pennies. Everyone laughed. But a month later, a black SUV pulled up to him, and the people inside weren't looking for him. They were looking for something that had been hidden in the walls for many years. Look what he found, and how it turned out. Subscribe, and write in the comments which city you're from. The desert had a way of swallowing sound, swallowing time, swallowing every certainty, until Dash the rumble of Makel's old Ford felt small and temporary against miles of sun-bleached emptiness. Heat shimmered across the asphalt, twisting the horizon into wavering, molten shapes that resembled distant cities, or water, or salvation. Though he knew they were nothing more than illusions the desert liked to offer to weary travelers. The sky stretched endlessly above him, vast, pale, streaked with thin threads of cloud that looked as though someone had dragged a comb across the heavens. He had been driving for hours, the kind of hours Derogi blurred together, and thoughts churned in slow, heavy circles, returning always to the same familiar ache. Divorce papers signed too easily, a daughter who no longer needed him, and a job he had lost without ceremony. Everything behind him felt used up, wrung out, emptied. Everything ahead, he didn't know yet. When the abandoned gas station came into view, it didn't appear gradually. It erupted from the flat land, like a skeleton rising from the dust. A crooked sign hung from rusted supports, its faded paint barely hinting at the brand it once represented. The roof slanted at an unnatural angle, threatening to collapse under its own weariness. Two ancient pumps, one red, one blue, leaned toward each other, as though sharing secrets. Their cracked paint scabbed and peeling from decades under the sun. Windows of the store behind them were smashed. Jagged bits of glass still clung to the frames like broken teeth. The whole structure looked less like a building and more like the husk of something that had once lived a decent life, before being picked clean by time, wind, and neglect. Yet Michael parked his truck, stepped out, and stared at the ruin with something close to reverence. This was what he'd bought, a condemned patch of desert floor with a roof half ready to collapse and walls that seemed to breathe dust. It was nothing, and yet it was everything he had left. He walked toward the pumps, feeling the crunch of gravel under his boots, his shadow long and stretched beside him. Even in its decay, the place had a presence, a stubbornness, as though it had refused to disappear when everything around it said it should. Maybe, in a strange way, they understood each other. He rested his hand on one of the pumps, feeling the rough, sun-baked surface warm against his palm. It was foolish, anyone else would have said. But standing there, with the empty road behind him and the forgotten station before him, he felt the first tug of something he hadn't felt in months, purpose, perhaps. Or maybe just a stubborn desire to bring something back to life, even if that something was just a neglected gas station on the wrong side of nowhere. Inside, the air smelled of dust, rust, and an old kind of loneliness that clung to the walls like a stain. The floor was littered with debris, scraps of paper, broken boxes, half-rotted shelving. A calendar from 1991 hung crookedly beside the counter, as though someone had meant to take it down, but never did. A small metal cash register sat on the counter, its drawer half open, showing nothing inside but sand blown in from the desert through cracks in the door. He moved slowly through the store, running his fingers along shelves that sagged under their own decay. He wasn't inspecting the space like a buyer evaluating a property. He was seeing work, problems, tasks he could put his hands on. He felt the familiar instinct kicking in, assess the structure, scout the damage, consider solutions. His life had fallen apart, but muscle memory hadn't. Behind the store, a small door led into what had once been a storage room or a break room for the old owner. It wasn't more than 12 feet wide, with a sagging cot in the corner and a kitchenette so rusted it looked fossilized. but there was a tiny window that let in a sharp slice of sunlight, and when Michael stepped inside, he pictured what it could be. A room he could sleep in while he worked, a place to rest without needing a motel miles away, a place that could become his, even if it was only a shack attached to a ruin. He spent the rest of the day exploring every cracked panel, every warped board, and the more he looked, the more he felt something inside him settling. Not comfort, but resolve. He could fix this. It would take time, sweat, tools, money he barely had. But Michael had spent his whole life turning broken things into usable ones. This was no different, just bigger. By evening, when the sun dipped and the desert wind cooled, he headed into the nearby town to grab food and supplies. The bar he entered was small, the kind of place locals occupied the same way people occupied front porches, out of habit, not desire. All conversation stopped when he walked in. A few men at the counter exchanged grins. One nudged the other with an elbow, and Michael knew before they even spoke that they recognized him. News traveled fast in towns where not much else happened. "So you're the guy who bought the old Miller station," one of them said, raising his glass with a smirk. "Heard you paid actual money for it." Another barked a laugh. "Should have just set your cash on fire, son. Would have saved time." "Place is cursed anyway," someone muttered. "Ask anybody who's lived here long enough." Michael didn't rise to it. He'd been mocked by better men and worse. But their words lodged somewhere under his ribs, not because he believed them, but because of how casually they were said, as if the station's failure was some natural law everyone accepted. Only one person didn't join the laughter, a woman in her 60s, sitting alone in the corner. Her hair was gray and pulled back, her expression calm in a way that felt carved from something older than the desert. When he passed her on his way out, she spoke without looking up. "That land remembers things," she said softly. "Be careful with what you wake up." He paused, waiting for more, but she just sipped her drink and stared ahead. The next morning he returned to the station before sunrise. The desert was still, holding its breath, as he unlocked the door and stepped into his new world. Work steadied him. He cleared shelves, swept dust, hauled out broken boards, ripped up ruined carpet. Each task was small, almost meaningless, but together they began to reveal the bones of the building beneath the decay. He shoveled dirt from the threshold, replaced a section of rotted floor, propped open the back door to let in fresh air. Soon his shirt clung to him with sweat. His shoulders ached, and dust coated his throat. But for the first time in months, the exhaustion felt right. It felt earned. In the afternoon, he decided to inspect the storage room more thoroughly. The metal lockers lining one wall were dented and rusted, but one of them drew his attention, not because it looked newer, but because its alignment was subtly off. It stood just a fraction closer to the wall than the others, as if someone had moved it and shoved it back hastily. He tugged at the locker. It groaned but didn't budge. He wedged a crowbar between the metal and the floor, applied pressure, and the locker lurched forward with a screeching protest. Behind it was a narrow recess carved into the wall. He knelt and reached inside, fingers brushing cool metal. A small safe. Heavy. Old. No combination dial, just a keyhole. He hauled it out, coughing as dust swirled up from the movement, and set it on the floor. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakably intentional. Someone had hidden it deliberately. The safe was locked. But next to it, tucked against the back of the recess, lay a stack of items wrapped in brittle cloth. He unwrapped them carefully. A faded map drawn by hand, showing sections of desert and 3 marked points. A black and white photograph of a man standing proudly beside these very gas pumps when they still stood straight and fresh. And a note, yellowed and fragile, words scrawled in ink that had bled with time. If someone else found this, it means I didn't make it." The sentence ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted. Michael felt something cold slide down his spine. It wasn't fear, at least not in the way he understood fear. It was the sense that the ruin he had bought, the ruin he thought was nothing more than a battered building waiting to be rebuilt, held a story larger than him. A story that hadn't been finished. A story someone had tried, perhaps desperately, to leave behind for whoever came next. He sat back on his heels, the safe beside him, the map spread across his lap, and the photograph clutched in his hand. The man in the picture stared out at him from decades ago, a faint smile on his face, unaware that his likeness would one day be found by a stranger kneeling in the dust. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose edges of the torn sign above the station. The desert whispered, dry and endless. And for the first time, Michael wondered if buying this place had been a choice, or if, in a strange way, something had been waiting for him to arrive. The morning after he discovered the hidden safe, the desert seemed to hold a different kind of silence, one that felt aware of him, as though it had opened a single eye and was quietly observing what he would do next. Michael woke early, his back stiff from the cot in the storage room, and his mind still circling the incomplete sentence on the fragile note. He lay for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of the previous day settle over him again. The gas station had been a ruin before, but now it was something else entirely, a place with secrets, a place someone had tried to protect or hide or escape from. The safe sat on the small table he had dragged into the room, mute and heavy, refusing to give up whatever it held. But the items wrapped beside it, the map, the photograph, the broken sentence, that was enough to pull him into a deeper story. After splashing water on his face and forcing down a breakfast made of crackers and canned peaches, he stepped outside. The sunrise cast long, slanting beams across the pumps, turning the rusted metal into streaks of red and gold. He looked toward the store windows, imagining the man from the photograph walking out of them years ago, unaware of how the place would decay. He wondered what had driven that man to hide a safe in the wall, why he had written a message he never finished, and why the map marked lonely points in the desert with such careful precision. And he wondered who else might know about all of it. As he returned to work, a restless feeling pushed at him. The station no longer felt like just a project. It felt like a trail left by someone who had vanished. Whether that trail had been meant for him or not didn't matter. Now, he was following it. He was repairing a section of flooring in the store when he heard the low growl of an engine drawing near. It wasn't the familiar rumble of an old pickup or the steady sound of a passing traveler. This engine sounded deeper, heavier. Michael set down the drill and wiped dust from his hands, just as a large, dark SUV rolled into the station lot, sending clouds of sand spiraling behind it. Tinted windows reflected the sun. The vehicle coasted to a stop not far from the pumps, and the engine continued to idle like an animal waiting for its handler's command. Two men stepped out. Both wore desert-worn boots and jackets too heavy for the heat, the kind of clothing you wore when you wanted pockets for things you didn't want others to see. The taller one scanned the station with a calculating expression, while the shorter one narrowed his eyes at the building as though expecting it to confess something. "You the new owner?" the tall man asked, stepping forward. His voice was smooth but held the residue of command, a tone practiced through use. Michael nodded. "That's right." The man gave a slow, deliberate glance over the store, the pumps, the ground, as if inspecting every inch. "Heard you're restoring it. Must be a lot of work." "No more than any other place left to bake in the sun for 30 years, Michael said. The men exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. "We were wondering," the shorter one said, "if you found anything unusual here while you were cleaning. Old stations like this sometimes have forgotten things. The pause before forgotten was so deliberate, it almost felt like a trap. Michael kept his face calm. Found a lot of trash and dust. Not much else. The shorter man stared at him too long, as if trying to read lies from the tilt of his head. The tall one looked toward the storage room door that led to where the safe now sat hidden. His eyes lingered there. When he finally turned back, he gave a smile too polite to be genuine. Well, if anything does turn up, let us know. Old owner left behind more than a few stories. And with that, they returned to the SUV, climbed in, and drove off without another word. The dust they kicked up drifted in the sun for a long time before settling. Michael stood still long after the engine faded. The men weren't curious. They were searching. They had asked the question too casually for it to be a simple inquiry, and they had looked at the door too directly for it to be coincidence. Someone else knew about the station's secrets, or at least suspected them, and that meant someone else wanted whatever was hidden there. He returned to the storage room, his step slower now. He looked at the safe on the table, the map beside it. The map's hand-drawn lines seemed more deliberate than ever, the marked points almost pulsing with meaning. He placed a hand on the safe, feeling its cold metal surface. Whoever hid this, likely the man named on the note, had been afraid of something. Or someone. And whatever had happened to him. The unfinished sentence suggested he hadn't left by choice. He needed answers. And answers weren't going to come from staring at the safe. They would come from understanding the man who hid it. The next day, he drove back into town, this time not to endure the stares of the locals, but to search for any trace of the station's previous life. The library stood on a quiet street near the courthouse, a small square building with a faded mural of desert wildlife on one wall. When he stepped inside, the cool air and dusty smell of old paper greeted him. A woman behind the counter looked up, adjusting her glasses. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for old newspapers," he said. "Specifically stories about the Miller gas station out on Route 16. She raised an eyebrow. "That's a name I haven't heard in a while. Follow me." She led him to a row of metal cabinets, filled with newspapers dating back decades. As he flipped through the pages, dust rising with each turn, he found small fragments of the past, a grand opening advertisement from the 1970s, a photo of the original owner, Harold Miller, shaking hands with a local official, mentions of a gas shortage, holiday sales. But then the tone changed. Articles became darker. Rumors of financial trouble, a citation for illegal fuel storage. Reports of unauthorized shipments arriving at night, complaints about activity behind the station. Then, finally, a short article. Not even front page, stating that Harold Miller had disappeared. No body found. No explanation given. Just gone. The librarian lingered nearby, watching him. When he looked up, she said quietly, "People said he got mixed up in dangerous things. They said he had information he shouldn't have had. But no one ever proved anything." Dangerous things? Like what? She hesitated, choosing her words. Corruption. Smuggling. Deals between the wrong people. Stuff folks around here don't talk much about. Especially people in power. Her meaning hung in the air like dust motes caught in sunlight. Driving back to the station, the desert felt different again. The road flat and straight looked less like an open path and more like a vein leading into something hidden and alive. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting the dark SUV to appear behind him. When he pulled into the lot, a strange unease crawled under his skin. He walked toward the storage room door, but halfway across the yard, he noticed something. Footprints. Not his. Not in the pattern of his boots. They led from the fence line toward the store, then back again. Someone had been there. He moved quickly to the storage room. The door was ajar by a few inches. He hadn't left it that way. Inside, The table where the safe had rested was empty. For a moment, his chest froze. But then he looked around, following instinct rather than panic. The safe lay on the floor behind a stack of crates, as though someone had dropped it while trying to lift it. The intruder must not have expected its weight. They had tried to take it and failed. He knelt and touched the safe, relieved to feel it intact. But the fact that someone had entered his space while he was gone ignited a slow burn in his stomach. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was pursuit. In the days that followed, the pressure from the town's administration intensified. He received an official notice claiming his repairs were unauthorized. Another insisted the underground fuel tanks, long emptied and sealed decades ago, were environmentally hazardous, requiring extensive testing. A third warned him that a full shutdown order might be issued. Each message carried the same, barely veiled message: give up. When he confronted the administration office, the clerk behind the counter pretended sympathy, but offered no help. "These are standard procedures," she said with a bland smile. "We're just following regulations." But the way she avoided his eyes told another story. Outside, he saw a familiar photograph hanging on the wall in the corridor. Carter's face, smiling confidently in a frame that celebrated local business leadership. The same Carter the men at the bar had mentioned. The same Carter who reportedly wanted the land. Back at the station that evening, the wind howled across the empty lot, stirring loose dust into swirling ghosts. He sat on the edge of the pump island and studied the map again. The markings seemed to pulse with possibility. Each point a message from the past, maybe a warning, maybe a trail left by a man who knew he was running out of time. He held the photograph of Harold Miller under the fading light, tracing the man's face with his eyes. The man had once stood where he now stood, smiling, proud, unaware of the storm that would swallow him. For the first time, Michael felt a strange kinship, not born from shared success, but from shared struggle. The desert had taken Miller's fate, but maybe it didn't have to take his. That night, he sat awake long after darkness fell, listening to the vast emptiness outside the thin walls of the storage room. The safe beside him gleamed faintly in the flashlight beam, an unspoken promise that what lay inside could unravel decades of silence, lies, and intimidation. He didn't know what would happen next, but he sensed one truth with growing certainty. Whatever Harold Miller tried to reveal, someone had buried it in fear. And now Michael Westbrook had unearthed it. As the desert wind whispered against the walls, carrying with it the weight of unfinished stories, he made a quiet decision. He would not be intimidated, not by bureaucrats hiding behind regulation, not by strangers in dark SUVs, not by a past that others had tried to erase. He would keep digging, keep searching, keep rebuilding. If the desert wanted to challenge him, he would answer. If the past wanted to surface, he would face it. And whatever Harold Miller had started, he would finish. The wind carried a different tone in the morning that followed, a tone that felt heavier, more expectant, as though the desert itself sensed that something long buried was about to surface. Michael stepped outside into the early dawn light, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders, and the silence around the station settled over him with an intensity that hadn't been there before. The unsafe visit from the strangers, the vanished footsteps in the sand, the escalating pressure from the administration. These things did not hang separately in the air. They formed threads of a net tightening slowly around him. But the safe was still inside. The map was still inside. The secrets that Harold Miller had tried to protect were still alive. And so was he. That, for now, was enough. He spent the early hours working not on repairs, but on searching, following instincts that had grown sharper with every unexplained intrusion. The storage room still felt violated, even though everything had been returned to its place. He checked each wall, each corner, each gap between boards. And it was then, while running his hand along a warped metal sheet near the back wall, that he felt a hollow vibration beneath his palm. A space. Something behind it. He pressed harder. The sheet flexed slightly. It wasn't part of the original wall. It was an addition, thin, unsteady, installed to conceal something. His heartbeat picked up. Using a screwdriver, he pried at the edge until the sheet tore free with a grating shriek, dust billowing into the air. Behind it lay a shallow cavity, and inside it, wrapped in old canvas, lay another box, larger, more carefully placed than the safe. He carried the box to the table, unwrapping its brittle cloth slowly, almost reverently. What emerged was not another safe, not something locked or reinforced, but a wooden case with metal hinges and a latch that clicked open with a faint pop. Inside, stacked neatly and protected from decay, were documents, pages and pages, yellowed but intact, filled with tight handwriting and clipped receipts, maps, names, dates, and what looked painfully like evidence. Real evidence. Financial records marked with the names of city officials, ledgers showing transactions that could not have been legal, inventory logs recording shipments arriving at the station at hours when the pumps were closed and customers were long gone. Some were signed, some stamped, some annotated with lines of frustration, as though the man who wrote them had been documenting not only facts, but a growing sense of dread. At the bottom of the case lay a notebook, thinner than the rest, bound with twine. He untied it and opened it carefully, the fragile pages whispering as they moved. The first entry was dated decades ago, the handwriting small and neat. "They think I don't know what they're doing," it read, "but they forget I built every inch of this place. They forget I know the sound of every truck that pulls in. They forget I can see the things they want hidden." With each paragraph, with each line, the story of Harold Miller unfolded his discovery of illegal operations involving powerful men in town, his attempts to gather proof, his growing fear that they knew he was watching. The entries became shorter, more frantic, the words cramped and rushed, the ink smeared in places. The last page was a single sentence, written with a trembling hand. "I don't know if I will make it out of here with this, but someone must." It wasn't an unfinished sentence like the one in the first safe. It was a farewell, one that Harold Miller never had the chance to see honored. Closing the notebook, Michael felt a surge of heat rise in him. Not anger, not fear, but the weight of a responsibility he had never asked for. Miller had gathered these documents as a shield, a final attempt to expose the corruption he had stumbled into. But it had cost him everything. Whoever had taken him, whoever had silenced him, still had influence in this small desert town. And now, by sheer accident or fate, that burden had fallen onto Michael. Night fell before he realized how long he had been reading. The desert outside the window glowed faintly under the moonlight. He stepped outside to clear his head, breathing in the cold air, letting the quiet settle while his mind churned. He had never wanted to be involved in anything dangerous. He had never sought out mystery or confrontation. He had come to this forgotten station because he wanted a place to rebuild his life, not to uncover someone else's destruction. But the truth lay in his hands, undeniable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that if he walked away now, this place would swallow yet another story whole. The next morning, he made his choice. The desert sun was just beginning to brighten the sky when he packed the documents, the maps, the notebook, and the photograph into a sturdy folder. He scanned each page with his phone, creating backups, copying files to multiple drives, just in case. The safe remained unopened. Its contents, whatever they were, felt like a final layer he wasn't ready to unveil. Not yet. But the wooden box, the evidence Miller had meant to deliver to someone, This was what mattered now. He drove to the neighboring county's administrative district, far from the reach of the corrupt local authorities. The building was newer, larger, its glass windows gleaming in the sunlight. He walked in with the calm determination of a man who had already faced down more than any paper pusher could intimidate him with. When he was directed to an investigator's office, someone who had no ties to the small desert town, he placed the folder on the desk without ceremony and said, "I need you to look at this, and you need to look at it now." The investigator's eyebrows rose when he saw the age of the documents, the names written on them. As he sifted through the pages, his expression changed from curiosity to alarm. When he finally looked up, his tone was more serious. "This is significant," he said. "If what's in here is verified, it could open several investigations. Some of these officials are still active." "I know," Michael said. "You should be careful." "I know that, too." He left the office with a receipt of intake and a promise that they would examine everything immediately. The weight that had clung to him since finding the first safe loosened slightly. He had done what Miller could not. He had gotten the truth into safe hands. Back at the station, things began to shift. The next day, the expected shutdown notice never came. Instead, he received word that the county had issued an order for an administrative review of the local council. No one visited the station to harass him. No SUVs circled the property. The town, it seemed, was suddenly otherwise occupied. And while the investigation unfolded miles away, he returned to the work that had been waiting for him long before the secrets appeared. He repaired the roof, replacing the rotted beams with new ones. He installed clean panes of glass where jagged shards had once caught the sun. He installed solar panels on the roof secondhand, but reliable, and wired them to a new battery bank. The pumps gained fresh coats of paint, restoring some of their original color. Inside, he scrubbed walls until the stains of decades began to lift. He replaced the flooring, built new shelves, repaired the plumbing, and converted the storage room into a livable space, complete with a small bed, a stove, and a simple wooden table beside the window. Some evenings, he worked until the desert sky turned deep blue and the stars emerged in their cold brilliance. The loneliness that once pressed on him like a burden had shifted into something else, a companion, a witness to his effort. Travelers began to stop by. A group of motorcyclists pulled in one afternoon, thankful for cold drinks and shade. A family on a long road trip paused for snacks and directions. A trucker who had broken down miles back arrived seeking tools and left promising to spread the word about the reviving station in the desert. Word spread faster than he expected. People liked stories of rebirth, of stubborn resilience. The station began to hum with quiet. Life small, steady, earned. When the regional news finally reported that several officials from his town had resigned amid an investigation, he wasn't surprised. He didn't celebrate, but he felt something inside him settle, the way dust settles after a long storm. The past had finally begun to be carried away. He spent that evening in the storage room, the safe beside him. For weeks he had avoided opening it, feeling that he needed to finish everything else first. But now the station stood on the edge of a new beginning. The roof was strong, the walls were bright again, the pumps gleamed, and he felt ready. After studying the lock, he found a way, slow, steady, patient. The metal groaned, the latch clicked, and the door swung open. Inside the safe lay only a single item, a photograph. He lifted it carefully. It was a picture of Harold Miller standing outside the station, smiling with a pride that cut through time. But in this photograph, he wasn't alone. A boy stood beside him, 10 years old at most, grinning widely, holding a wrench too big for his hands. Father and son. The back of the photograph bore a date and 2 words written in a steady hand. For him. There was no treasure of wealth, no coded message. The treasure was the truth Miller had sacrificed everything to preserve. And now, the truth was free. Michael placed the photograph on the shelf above his bed, where the morning sunlight would touch it each day. Then he stepped outside, breathing deeply as the desert wind swept across the newly restored station. He looked at the pumps, at the store, at the horizon stretching unbroken into miles of possibility. The place was no longer a ruin. It was a beginning. He had not planned for any of this. He had come here because he needed something to rebuild. And somehow, in the middle of nowhere, he had found a purpose tied to another man's unfinished story, a story he had now completed. As the last light faded, he whispered toward the desert, toward the memory of Harold Miller, toward the dust that had concealed too much for too long. It's done. I finished it. And in the vast stillness of the twilight, it felt as though the land itself finally exhaled. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. Watch the next video, check out the others on the channel, and share this one with someone who needs it.